I beg to move this House to now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am pleased to have secured this adjournment debate on statutory support for self-employed adoptive parents. Self-employed adopters are currently excluded from any statutory parental pay. For far too long, this exclusion has been overlooked as too niche a problem. But in fact, it exposes a much deeper inconsistency in the way our parental leave and pay system works, one that affects not only adoptive families but also the wider functioning of the adoption system in England. This debate comes at an especially challenging time for adopted children and adoptive families. Demand for post-adoption support is rising, including mental health services, therapeutic help and emotional support, while the availability of these services has become more uncertain, uneven and under-resourced. A recent investigation by the BBC uncovered systemic issues within post-adoption support, highlighting challenges I will cover later in my speech, and no doubt we will hear from other members. But first, I would like to address the issue which has led to this debate. There is currently a deep inconsistency in the way our parental leave and pay system works for adoptive families. At present, employed birth parents can access statutory maternity leave and pay. Self-employed birth parents can access maternity allowance, which is equivalent to maternity pay. Employed adopters can access statutory adoption leave and pay, but self-employed adopters cannot access any form of statutory adoption leave or pay. The consequence is that adoptive parents who are self-employed face a uniquely disadvantaged position, with no statutory mechanism enabling them to take time away from work to support a child entering their family, a child who we know is more than likely going to have experienced trauma, loss or disruption. We know that self-employment now makes up a large part of the workforce, with around 4.4 million people working for themselves across the UK. It is estimated that self-employed adopters make up 10% of adopters annually. Given that just over 3,000 adoptions took place last year, that means hundreds of families a year are left with no statutory financial support at the moment they take legal and parental responsibility for a child. It is important, though, to be clear about what adoption pay is actually for and why it exists. Unlike maternity provision, which has historically been justified by the government on health and recovery grounds, statutory adoption pay exists for a different purpose altogether. In 2022, the previous government stated in a written parliamentary response that statutory adoption pay is essential to the success of an adoption placement, so that an adopter takes time off work in order to care for and, most importantly, to bond with their child. This I will give way.
Can I first of all commend the Honourable Lady for South West Devon for bringing this forward? I spoke to her beforehand. I asked for her permission to intervene and give her very quickly a Northern Ireland perspective. In Northern Ireland, shared parental leave and pay, SPL, SHPP, are entitlements as financial support for adoptive parents. If one adopter qualifies for SAP, couples may share leave pay under SPL, but this presumes that employment under a qualifying employer. So does the Honourable Lady, and I think this is the objective she's trying to achieve, does the Honourable Lady agree that in terms of all legally binding work contracts, all employers should be incentivised to ensure employees can qualify for shared adoption leave, and in fact there should be an onus for them to do just that?
Smith.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that contribution, and particularly for highlighting the case in Northern Ireland. And I know that ensuring that parental leave for adopters and shared parental leave was something that the last government fought hard to bring in. So, of course, that is something that I'm sure I'd agree with him, should be across the entire aisles that we live in. But ultimately, that will be for the Minister to talk about as well. Although I'm guessing it's probably a devolved issue as well. But no doubt that will come up in his remarks a bit later. So I thank you for that. So as I was saying, in 2022, the previous government had that response which says that they take the time off to care for and bond with their child, and that principle must be fairly applied regardless of whether a parent is employed or self-employed. Now, for self-employed adoptive families, the negative consequences of this disparity are clear. Evidence gathered by Home for Good and Adoption UK through the all-party parliamentary group on adoption and permanence found that 60% of self-employed adopters report the absence of financial support directly limited the amount of leave they could take at the start of adoption, and in some cases prevented them from taking leave altogether following that adoption. In practical terms, this means returning to work within days or weeks of placement, despite being advised by professionals that it is best to take time off work to be able to support their child once they are placed. One self-employed adopter summed up the pressure by saying, "We have been through 2 separate adoptions. The second time I had no choice but to keep working. I sometimes took my son with me. It was very hard." The all-party group's research also found that around 2/3 or 63% of prospective self-employed adopters said the lack of statutory provision played a major role in delaying or preventing them from proceeding with adoption in the first place. Nearly half of self-employed adopters said that it prevented them from adopting again, while others explained that they could not consider adopting their child's sibling because the financial impact of taking extended time away from work was simply too great. As a result, children are being unnecessarily separated from their siblings. One family said, "We have already been approached to adopt another sibling and had to say no because there was no financial package available to help." Further research from the all-party group on adoption and permanence found that the majority, 59%, of self-employed adopters reported stopping work altogether for a period once the child was placed with them, not as a lifestyle choice, but because the intensity of needs present made continued self-employment impossible. For many families, the absence of statutory provision creates profound pressure at precisely the moment the emotional and practical demands of adoption are at their highest. As one parent explained, "Not having an equivalent to maternity allowance meant the pressure on us was increased at a time when the pressure on our family was already very high. We didn't have access to the kind of mental or financial breather that a secure income for a set period might have given us, and inevitably it made the whole early placement period more stressful." This strain is reflected in reporting anxiety levels among prospective self-employed adopters who rated their financial worry during the adoption process as an average of 7 out of 10. Established self-employed adopters also report elevated anxiety of 6 out of 10, showing that stress does not end once placement is secured, but often continues long afterwards in the absence of statutory support. These findings must be understood within the broader context of adoption pressures. It's not just about this parental leave. As of September this year, there were 2,940 children with a placement order waiting to be matched with an adoptive family in England, and average waiting times from entering care to placement with a family are exceeding 20 months. If government policy deters capable families from coming forward to adopt, this does not only disadvantage adopters themselves, but most importantly, it also directly affects the life prospects of children who remain in temporary care arrangements for longer than necessary. This is because, in part, the system has made permanency through adoption unaffordable for too many who would otherwise open their home. But as I said at the start of my speech, a lack of statutory support for self-employed adopters cannot be considered in isolation from the adoption system as a whole. I am concerned that adoption is still treated as something that ends at placement, rather than a responsibility that continues for a lifetime. Nearly all adoptive families say that more must be done to ensure children feel safe and secure as they grow up, and over half report that support drops away once the adoption order is made. Now, there is cross-party recognition that adoption cannot be treated as a single moment in a child's life. It is not simply a legal process that ends with an order. It is the beginning of a lifelong journey for both the child and the family that welcomes them. When we reduce adoption to a one-off placement, we overlook the ongoing needs that often emerge long after the order is made. If we're serious about giving adopted children the best possible start, then we must be honest about the nature of adoption itself. It is a lifelong commitment that requires consistent, compassionate, and accessible support. Families should not have to fight for the help that allows their children to flourish. Adoption should be backed by the commitment from all of us to stand with these families, not just at the beginning, but throughout the years that follow. Current practice too often fails adopted families at moments of vulnerability. Many adoptive parents report long waits for mental health services, difficulty accessing meaningful support, inconsistent local authority approaches, and lack of trauma-informed provision in schools. So we need an adoption system that sticks with adopted children and their families over the long term and is flexible and responsive to their changing needs as they face challenges across these areas. These problems affect all adopters, employed and self-employed alike, but their financial impact is unevenly distributed. All of this is being compounded by the sudden and unexpected changes to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund announced in April, which significantly reduced the post-adoption support many adoptive families rely on, including for families in my constituency, contributing to a growing sense of uncertainty and a weakening of trust towards the system. For families who cannot afford private help, the situation becomes even more difficult and the financial strain quickly grows. Many simply have no way to cover the cost of therapy on their own, and for those who are self-employed, the pressure is even greater because this burden arrives at the same time as the lack of statutory pay, leaving them with few options and even less stability. So for self-employed adopters, the impact is even heavier because any time taken away from work to help support children can immediately affect their income. When post-adoption support is withdrawn, they cannot rely on payroll to cushion the loss. Instead, they absorb it through missed work, reduced earnings, and unpaid days spent trying to manage crises on their own. Self-employed adopters are navigating a range of interconnected pressures that overlap, intensify each other and shape every part of their experience, and local authority practice reflects the same fragmentation. Support for self-employed adopters varies wildly depending on where families live. Freedom of information requests reveal that 1/3 of councils have no policy in place at all to support self-employed adopters, and the remaining councils refer to using a means-tested approach to assessing the need for financial help. In these councils, 90% of adopters were not informed that local support might be available. This produces an arbitrary system in which families adopting can experience different outcomes simply depending on postcode rather than need. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this adjournment debate also follows a recent Westminster Hall debate that was brought about by an e-petition on maternity and paternity pay. Members, including me, explicitly raised the position of self-employed adoptive families. The government has indicated that a review of parental leave and pay is underway and that the issues raised through the recent parliamentary debate will inform this process. If the review is to be taken seriously by adoptive families, it must look properly at the position of self-employed adopters rather than letting their needs disappear into maternity and paternity reform more generally. Clarity on this point is essential. Adoption pay cannot be an optional extra. It ensures that adopters can establish stability, attachment and routine with a child who may have experienced disruption, neglect or loss. It enables parents to be present rather than forced to divide attention between the urgent demands of work and the equally urgent demands of care. So I'd like to end by asking the Minister, who I know has a deep care for these issues as well, so that's why this debate is a good opportunity to raise these. First, will the review formally assess the position of self-employed adopters as a distinct category within parental leave and pay review? Secondly, will the government evaluate the introduction of a statutory entitlement equivalent to maternity allowance for self-employed adopters? Thirdly, can the Minister provide an indication of timescale for the publication of the review's findings? And finally, I urge the government to reverse the disastrous decision to reduce the funding available through the Adoption and Special Guardian Support Fund. Policy choices must support adoption and adoptive parent families. Enterprise and self-employment should also be encouraged. Self-employed adoptive families should not be penalised. The removal of avoidable barriers to adoption while enabling business to flourish must be a priority.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to start by thanking the Honourable Member for securing this debate and highlighting these important issues. Having spoken to her in our first week in this place as newly elected Members of Parliament, I know she cares deeply about these issues and I welcome her bringing them to the attention of the House in this adjournment debate. I want to open my remarks with a word of special thanks to everybody who has stepped up in our country to adopt children. It is an extraordinary act that makes a transformational difference for children and families right the way across this country. I recognise that self-employed adopters do not have access to statutory adoption pay. I appreciate too that they do not qualify for statutory maternity pay or maternity allowance. I am pleased that the parental leave and pay review is looking...
I beg to move this House to now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased that the Parental Leave and Pay Review is looking at these issues as part of their work, and I encourage members to engage actively with this review as it continues to be underway. The Department for Education's statutory guidance is clear that where self-employed adopters do not qualify for any statutory payment, local authorities can consider making a payment that is equivalent to the maternity allowance. Gladly give way, yes.
Mr. Smart.
Very grateful to the Minister. He mentioned the review, and he said that it's underway. He didn't mention how long it would take, and I note that the Honourable Member asked for some guidance on timeline. I'd be grateful if he could give that, and further, if he could use his good offices to encourage local authorities to let potential self-employed adopters know that their discretionary funds exist, because as the Honourable Lady mentioned, most don't.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for the questions. I'll turn briefly in a moment to answer directly the questions that the Honourable Member asked, but I do take the broader point about encouraging local authorities to make sure that adopters in their area are aware of the support that is available to them. As I was saying, the local authorities can consider making a payment that is equivalent to the maternity allowance. This allows authorities to target adopters most in need of financial support, though I take the Honourable Member's point made very powerfully on the inconsistency of that offer across England at the moment. To answer the Honourable Member's questions directly, first of all, the parental leave review started in July of this year, and it is expected to last 18 months. So we should be able to work back from there on when we expect its conclusions and publication. The review has a wide scope, but it is looking specifically at adoption support as part of that. It is firmly within the scope of the review. And finally, I'll turn to broader adoption support, which the Honourable Member asked me about as well. The Department for Education does make wider support available for all adoptive families. This year, £50 million was made available to support adopters and adoptive families through the Adoption Special Guardianship Support Fund. I appreciate that the changes we made to the ASGSF in April this year have been very difficult for some families, and I've listened carefully to what families have told me about these changes. I speak regularly to adopters and those working in the adoption system, and we will start a formal process of engagement on long-term decisions in the new year. Details of the ASGSF from April 2026 will be made available once departmental business planning decisions are completed, and I'm expecting this to come very soon. So far this year, we have approved applications to support over 14,000 families through the fund. We have also invested £8.8 million this year into Adoption England for services across the country. Adoption England are doing a huge range of work to develop support for families through regional adoption agencies. For example, a new core offer of support for the first 12 to 18 months of a match between a child and a family. Fundamentally, though, stood back from adoption leave, the government is taking bold steps to transform the entire children's social care system. This is set out in our Families First partnership programme, which we announced very recently. We were upping the funding for to take it to £2.4 billion over the next 3 years. This change is fundamental to the whole system because it will reset in a way that many members across this House have been arguing for years, the system away from late-stage crisis intervention towards earlier, more intensive support for families. And those are families of all shapes and sizes. That should be the bedrock of the future children's social care system. And in parallel, the investment and changes that are going into the NHS to ensure that health services are able to respond to the mental health needs of families and children, particularly the most vulnerable, again will act as a bedrock, though we do recognise there are special needs for support for those adoptive families. To close my remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to thank again the Honourable Member for their speech, for securing this debate, and welcome their acknowledgement of the difference that adopters are making across the country. I also welcome the attention of the Parental pay and leave review to this area of work. And I look forward to engaging with adopters and members from across this House, as well as stakeholders who work in the adoption system in the new year, including my department's adopter reference group, as we work to confirm the long-term arrangements for adoption support.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order